Welcome to Know the Love of Christ. Hey everyone, we're back. Today we're going to study Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Just as a recap, we went through chapter 3 last week where the author talked about seasons, a time to do this and a time to do that. And we discussed that. And then we talked about the blessing that God gives, and then he goes into a little bit of a downward spiral again, but then comes back from that, and he kind of talked about a little about how man and beast are the same, and we discussed that. So this week we're going to read chapter 4. I'm going to read from the New King James Version. Then I returned and considered all the oppression that is done under the sun. And look, the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors there is power, but they have no comforter. Therefore I praise the dead who are already dead, more than the living who are still alive. Yet better than both is he who never existed, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. Again I saw that for all toil and every skillful work a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. Better a handful with quietness than both hands full, together with toil and grasping for the wind. Then I returned and I saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone without companion. He has neither son nor brother, yet there is no end to all his labors. Nor is his eye satisfied with riches. But he never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is vanity and a grave misfortune. Two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, two can withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. Better a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who will be admonished no more. For he comes out of prison to be king, although he was born poor in his kingdom. I saw all the living who walk under the sun. They were with the second youth who stands in his place. There was no end of all the people over whom he was made king, yet those who come afterward will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and grasping for the wind.
I had a thought while you were reading. I don't think we realized how much we quote Ecclesiastes. Like, there are so many little snippets that you find people saying, and the one about the threefold cord is a really popular thing that people quote from the Bible, and they're talking about companionship, and we hear it a lot at weddings, it seems, and that's not necessarily the context, but it can be applied like that, I guess. But I was just thinking about it. I feel like every chapter we've gone through, there's been at least one small chunk that is commonly used.
Yeah.
I wonder if people know that it comes from Ecclesiastes. I wonder.
Maybe we can start pointing that out. Did you know that was in the Bible? Spread the seed.
All right, so something I was reading recently said that this is really the beginning of a section, a chunk of the book, where we go from having really organized sections and complete like chapters, but I mean just very large chunks of scripture that are all pointing toward one thing. And it gets very much like the Proverbs when we start here in chapter 4 through about, I think it's somewhere in chapter 10 when that stops, where we're going to have shorter sections, kind of like it is in Proverbs, where it'll address a certain topic. And it'll, I don't want to say discombobulate, that's not the right word for it, but it jumps around quite a bit. I mean, all of this is kind of in light of hevel, vanity. But this is chapter 4, verse 1 is really the start of that.
I heard it described fairly recently, the vanity, how hevel is literally smoke. or vapor or mist. And it's beautiful. If you ever sat there and watched a bonfire or even a little, a backyard fire pit and watched the smoke, and it's really with the swirls and the depth of it, and it's really a beautiful thing, but you go to grasp it and you can't. You might get a little bit, you might get a hint of the smoke and smell in your hands, but you cannot grasp it. And the running theme, like you were getting ready to say, was that all this is here. It's beautiful. Even the ugly parts of it is beautiful. But we're going to try to grasp at it. Like, we're going to grasp at the beautiful things, right? Because we don't want the ugly things. We don't want to deal with the ugly. We don't want to deal with death. We don't want to deal with heartache. We don't want to deal with toil. We're not going to grasp at that. We're going to try to grasp at the beautiful things, but we just can't get it. Because in the end, under the sun, that's really not beautiful. It's what's beyond is what's beautiful. And that's graspable. Is that a word?
Attainable.
There you go. Attainable.
There's a word they taught us in school. Tangible things. That's the thing. Like the tangible things here, these are temporal things. Mm-hmm. And what's everlasting is our soul and the things that are beyond. But there's this idea that we see throughout the book, but especially I think in this chapter, where there is no gain without God. Mm-hmm. Like everything under the sun. I mean, you can have God in your life, but really us trying to navigate this life without God is the hevel. But he mentions all these things are good. Like in chapter 3, verse 12, there's nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. This idea that, it is all hevel. It's utterly hevel. But to try to remove God from it makes it even further hevel. It's already hard to navigate and manage life. Going back to verses 1 through 3 on oppression. When I think of comfort, I think about the passage in 2 Corinthians 1. Where verse 3 it says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God." I always have a hard time reading that. I have an even harder time quoting it.
I have a hard time understanding
the comfort with which we are comforted. But basically, God is the Father of comfort, and he comforts us. And in turn, we're able to comfort others because we've been comforted with that hope and that mercy and that grace, I think, is the idea there. And so when we're looking at 1 through 3 in the light of companionship, like that first verse right there when he talks about, "Behold the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them." You can hear the weight in his voice. But the thing, I think, like even with Solomon and the way he was living and the things he was doing that were wrong, he still had this base here that I think we all should have. And that is, if it's a human being, I should not enjoy seeing that human being suffer. This should be my response right here. Like life is horrible, is basically what he's saying. Like life is vain, but it's just awful. And part of that is because there are those who are oppressed and they have no comfort. Like it's bad enough to be tortured and oppressed, but it's even worse to have that and have no one to lean on, either before, after, or during. And I think about all the people that are out in the world. If God was loving, God wouldn't allow this to happen. But God gives us free will, and he's not going to control us because he loves us. Mm-hmm. That deep, abiding, eternal love that he has allows us to make the choice, because it wouldn't be love to control us like that. And so I think that's, a theme, I guess, that I see there.
He starts off with, "Then I returned and considered all the oppression that is done under the sun." He just got finished talking about man and beast, how we have one breath, we all return to the dust. And he even says that man has no advantage. But what we do have, we discussed this last time, so I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail. But I think what he's trying to say here is that So we are above the beast because, Jesus mentions we're worth more than the crows and the lilies. Life is going to be hard for everyone.
Yeah.
No one's exempt from it. And so, like you said, if we don't have God, that's where our advantage is. Humans can have God.
Yeah. And beyond that, I mean, as image bearers and as the church, we have the opportunity to be his hands and feet and to provide that comfort, which is kind of bringing that 2 Corinthians 1 passage in. But yeah, I see what you're saying. All right, so for verses 4 through 6, I had it written down. When you break those down, it feels like they're saying different things. I don't know if you noticed that. Like verse 4 talks about, I saw the toil and skill and work, and it comes from envy of his neighbor, and it's vanity and striving after the wind. And then verse 5 says, the fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. And then verse 6 says, better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and a striving after wind. Really, this in verse 4 where it talks about toil and skill and work come from a man's envy of his neighbor, that kind of work is the kind that's always grasping for more, like a workaholic. I was telling Dee about, before we started, hustle culture. We have this hustle culture, and it's like, if you have a hobby, you need to monetize that. If you like to write, you need to start a blog and monetize that. And it's like everything is to the end of making more money so that you can have a better life. And Solomon would say that's hevel, because in the end you die and you're going to leave it to you don't know who. But we do have that, especially in the United States, the hustle culture. I mean, it is so hard to step back and you don't even know you're doing it sometimes. And sometimes it's not necessarily to make money. It's for advancement or popularity or, the likes and everything like that on social media. But so that's verse 4, the work that grasps for more than what you need. Your hands are full and you're still reaching in the bowl. Verse 5 is the opposite of that. And he's saying that's a fool that folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Basically, this person doesn't work. This person is trying to escape. And I think about that, like with my anxiety, there are days that I do want to escape and I don't want to do anything. And life seems like, I almost said insanely, extremely overwhelming. And it's hard to get things done. But this person is just, it's a laziness. I don't know. I would say it goes deeper than that. It's a person that they do it to their own detriment. It's not just lazy. It's you ruin your life in pursuit of not doing anything. And then verse 6 is kind of happy middle ground. It says, better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and a striving after the wind. So neither 4 nor 5 is right. 6 is a balance, which it talks about the toil. But if you have both hands full and you're striving after the wind, you're working so hard and there's no rest, you can't enjoy it. Verses 7 through 8 briefly. It makes me so sad to think that there are really people like this in the world that are just completely alone. And riches are never enough. They aren't, because they can be spent, they go away, they come and go. Solomon was given the choice to ask for riches, and he asked for wisdom. I feel like he knows something about this because he does have all the riches there. But he would know that without people to share it with, it's just vain.
It's interesting that the first section, like 1 through 3, is about the oppressed, right?
Mm-hmm.
4 through 8 is about selfish toil. So it's about being oppressed and oppressors. And then it's about self-satisfaction. And then after that, he goes into friendship or companionship. Like it flows, but then it doesn't, like we discussed before. So you have the oppressed, loneliness, and then the toil, like self-inflicted loneliness. And then the value of companionship is the contrast.
Yeah. Which, like we said, the overall kind of theme for this chapter, I would say, is companionship. I don't know if you would say that, but I think it breaks down into all the sections. Mm-hmm. And so I think that definitely fits in there. But if we want to go ahead and move into 9 through 12, this is that section that I was saying is very popularly quoted, and it really is. In weddings, two are better than one, talking about being one flesh. It starts out at the end of verse 9, it says, they have a good reward for their toil. And then it says, and sets out these 3 verses of different examples of things that can happen. And so verse 10, if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. So that would be something like a stumbling, a mistake of sorts, some kind of circumstance that you fall in. Because, that could be metaphorical as well if you want to apply it that way. When we think about in our own lives, when we stumble and we don't have someone there to help us get out of the mess we've gotten into, that's very hard. It's very hard. But then past that, verse 11, another situation, if 2 lie together, they keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? So when just life throws what it has at you, we think about different circumstances like poverty, but also weather, I think about like the hurricanes and the tornadoes and all that kind of thing. And then 12, though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him. A 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. When abuses and hostility are hurled at you, all these different examples are the rewards that we get from companionship, that these things aren't as hard alone or together as they are alone. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
But if we want to take it a further step, who's the true companion? Who's the best companion? Jesus. So when I think about that and how that would apply here, but it's true. Jesus is he should be our best friend.
He's been there, done that.
Oh, he has been
He's
there,
gone
done
through it all.
Mm-hmm. He hasn't sinned, so I can't take it there. Kind of in the way that Deuteronomy 6 says, teach these things to your children, and then it lays out, it seems very simple. It lays out the broad generalizations of your life. When you walk by the way, when you sit and you lie down. I feel like this passage kind of does that here for companionship. It generalizes the situations of life. All right, so polishing off the chapter, verses 13 through 16, where it speaks of that foolish king, and basically it's better to be a poor and wise youth than an old foolish king who won't take advice, which that's kind of countercultural. Most people would think age means wisdom and power and security. They're saying, it's better to be poor and young, which means you would be, you wouldn't have the respect. You don't have the advantages, the physical advantages, and you don't have the experience that an older person has. It's better to be there and be wise in your youth than it is to be old and to have gone past that and regress. Oh, or please.
No, I'm just thinking what you were saying. Or is he saying it's better as a poor and wise youth, like in his ignorance, than the old foolish king who's experienced it all and just doesn't want to
Which would connect back up to verse 2, which we really did not talk much about, verse 2 and 3, where he basically says it's better to have never lived, which is some heavy stuff.
Because he says, I saw all the living who walk under the sun. They were with the second youth who stands in his place, which would be what? The next generation. So this is a whole new generation coming after him, and they don't know what this generation has experienced because they didn't have time to acquire, to toil for that selfish gain.
I don't know. I really don't.
Well, that just leaves us hanging now, doesn't it?
Yes.
But he says, surely this surely also is vanity.
I think yours makes more sense in the context. Because to me, that's the thing. I feel like 13 through 16 is extremely disjointed here, like compared to the rest, which I struggled with this before we got to the episode. So, Oh, I wonder if it is the second generation. What do you guys think, listeners? Why don't you get in touch with us and tell us what you think? But that wraps up the chapter. So we need to ask our important question. Where do you see the love of Christ in this passage?
Can I say the whole thing?
If you want to.
Well, because, Jesus understood oppression. He was oppressed throughout his whole ministry with the pharaohs, with the Pharisees always trying to trap him, the people thronging him. So he understood that, and he didn't have a comforter per se, like his friends, his apostles that he was with all the time. They were, yes, his friends, but they didn't truly understand, like we discussed in Mark, when we studied Mark last season, how they didn't really understand what was unfolding in front of their eyes. So Jesus understood oppression. He understood being alone. His selfish toil, I guess you can kind of say he was selfish because he wants everyone to come to him, but not selfish in a mean way. Because, he is a jealous God.
Yeah. I don't know if I would say it's
Is
selfish
it
because
right?
even
It's not
in wanting everyone to
selfish.
come, it's not to his benefit. He gets like you can't be selfish without it being a benefit to you, right? So I don't know if I'd call it selfish toil, but like
Well, anyway, he understood
the balance there.
definitely the balance of it. He understood being alone, working, not having anyone understand him. He understood the value of friendship.
Mm-hmm.
He's the best friend we can have. He understands what we go through day in and day out. And 13 through 16 sounds like him. It sounds just like him. So I can't pick out one verse because I see
just
it.
chapter 4.
I do. I see it throughout the whole thing. I see it as Jesus saying this, basically, because he understands it. He's been there, done that.
I guess I could go the same route and say, but I see it in the companionship, the emphasis on having companions, because life is really, really difficult. And even the most introverted of people have their person. They have someone. Because, there are so many people going through life who are trying to do it alone, and it's pure misery. And when they realize that we have been created for connection, God has put that desire into our hearts to be connected to others. And you look at how he set up his church in 1 Corinthians 12, it talks about it. In Romans 12, 9 through 21, it talks about it a little. I already brought up 2 Corinthians 1:4, where we comfort with comfort by which we were comforted. None of us is going to get out alive, but we can get out whole. And I think having community is part of that. And the fact that God has given us as I don't know if the whole tribe thing is still used these days. I'm not hip. But we talk about it takes a village, it takes a tribe. We talk about that for our kids, but we need that too. We need godly people surrounding us, helping us, pushing us on, encouraging us, telling us when we're wrong in a loving way. But God gave that to us so that we wouldn't have to experience hevel at its deepest, darkest form. And with God, it is easier. It doesn't mean it's easy, but it's better. Because like 2 Corinthians 1:4 says, we are to be most pitied if we are doing all this and there's no purpose. But the opposite is true. That we are most blessed by the fact that this isn't the case, that there is more to life than what's here, and that's what we're living for, and we'll be rewarded for that, and we'll get to be with him for all eternity. So there's my very long-winded version of where I see the love of Christ in this passage.
All right, good. Well, thanks again for joining us. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to contact us. Let us know what you think about verses 13 through 16 too. We're curious to know. Also, if you want to study, we would love to study with you. And if you are not local to us, we can find someone that's local to you that can study with you. And as always, we hope that you will seek to know the love of Christ in your life. And until next time, bye.
Bye.
If you like this episode, be sure and share it with someone. In doing so, you're sharing the love of Christ.